the role of the rep is absolutely vital at the moment. There is several big cons being done on working people, and the workplace representative is the voice of the trades union movement, talking to members, ensuring that our opinion is what comes to dominate in every workplace, and that reps can be part of building the action that we are going to need if we're going to challenge these things. Because I was vice president of SERTUC, my former political life before being elected to be Deputy General Secretary of the NUT was in London. But I've been privileged, since being elected, to go around the country. And just in the last 2 weeks, I've been to Leicester, Nottingham, Coventry, to Sunderland. And in all of those places, there are groups of workers who are having demonstrations outside the town hall. And I think it's really starting to pick up. That there are demonstrations, that there are newborn trades councils, that there are people saying that the meeting that we just had was twice as big as we expected it to be. We thought it was going to be the same old lags there again, and it wasn't. There was a new layer of people. There were some younger people. There were some people affected by a particular cut, and them coming together. And I think that's a really important, a bit of buoying up that we need at the moment, because it does feel so hard, but things are starting to pick up. I think the demonstration by the students and UCU last week, leave aside the stuff about the violence in the Tory party headquarters, leave that aside. The 52,000 people was far more than the government expected. It was more than UCU and NUS expected, and it's the real sign that things are starting to pick up, I think. What I want to do is talk about the three cons that the government is trying to pull over on working class people and what I think we should be saying about them, and then something about the action that I think we're going to need in order that workplace representatives are going to be vital in if we're going to start to unpick it. And what I see the three cons are, is this con that it is the public sector that is the cause of the crisis, this con that we're all in it together, and this con that there is no alternative. And those are three big questions that our movement has to be able to answer to the satisfaction of working people around us. And then, like I said, to go on and talk about the action. So this first con, the crisis in our economy is the public sector deficit. We all know it's absolute rubbish, but it's astonishing that they've managed to make this stick for so long, that when there is a banking crisis and we bail the banks out to keep the economy going, and then they are sitting down last week talking about how they are going to distribute £6 billion worth of bonuses, and yet we're still taking it on that it's the public sector deficit that is to blame. That is an astonishing trick they've managed to pull, and I think it worked for some time. The studies that the TUC did showed that many working people did believe that there was a big problem with the public sector deficit. But those numbers on the opinion polls are starting to turn as people see the cut coming towards them, and they see the fact that the bonuses are still being paid. People are getting, I think, the arithmetic right and starting to see that it is not our fault, and that the public sector and the services that working people have shouldn't be what's at the root of this. They say, don't they, that we're all in it together. And Martin talked about Lord Hutton. His view that people have never had it so good, that is such a weird way to look at the world. And it shows you that they're just looking at it from the point of view of a very narrow layer of people. The fact that there are only 4 of them round the cabinet table who are not millionaires gives you the sense of how they make decisions. I think that Ed Miliband should have been on the telly this morning, not only attacking Lord Hutton, Lord Young, which he did, but also the fact that their cuts advisor is a bloke called Sir Philip Green. He's the boss of Arcadia, which is a high street conglomeration, and he's the person they've brought on board to advise them how to make cuts in public services. You need to know the truth about Sir Philip Green, that in 2005 he paid himself a personal dividend of £1.2 billion. Personal dividend, not to his company, to him and his family. £1.2 billion. He's a very generous man, and he gave it all to his wife. And she lives in Monaco. So they didn't pay £300 million worth of tax on it. That sort of person, that avariciousness that you think you need £1.2 billion, and then having got it, that you don't even bother to pay the £300 million tax that's due on it, to the country where you made the money in the first place, to the services that the people who buy the stuff in Topshop rely on. They rely on those services. You don't even pay it. That tells you something about the idea that we're all in the same boat together. Their advisors are definitely not in the same boat as me and you on the millions of working class people in this country. Sometimes there's another way of talking about that. My General Secretary, Christine Blower, has a very good way of saying it. Maybe we are all in the same boat. They were all in the same boat on the Titanic. But what happened to you then depended on what class you were in. If you were in first class on the Titanic, you got on a lifeboat, and if you were in steerage, you drowned. So, you know, they say we're all in the same boat, but they are treating us all very differently on that same boat. And their third con, that there is no alternative, where we have to learn some basic economics. They say the public sector deficit is unsustainable. It's 57% of the gross domestic product. They say that's a big figure. Between 1916 and 1961, it was never less than 100% of GDP. So it's not a historically high figure. In 1945, the public sector debt, I mean, there had been events before 1945 that you'll be aware of, but the public sector deficit then was 250% of GDP. And that's when the Labour government started building the NHS, not when they finished building it. So it's absolutely not true, and no sensible, you know, there are many economists on left and right who absolutely disagree with the way they are behaving with regard to this deficit. If there is a gap, then Martin has talked about how to address it. We bailed out the banks. I think in many ways you have to keep the economy going, so you want to put some money in to make it keep going. But after you've done that, you want to get something back from them. The Robin Hood tax that the government is turning down, a tiny tax on transactions, 0.05%, would bring in £30 billion a year. The tax avoidance and tax evasion in this country is conservatively estimated as £120 billion a year. But you see again the decisions they make. They concentrate on welfare scroungers. I don't think anybody supports scrounging, but welfare scrounging, the biggest figure they can put on it is something like 1% of the value of tax evasion and tax avoidance, but they are intent on dismissing the people who work in Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, whose job it is to pursue the tax avoidance and tax evasion measures. So they are making a set of political choices. I know that you know these things already, but it's your job as a workplace rep to engage people in conversation in workplaces so that these arguments are the arguments that come to dominate in every workplace. And I think there should be some discussion today about where that process is up to. What do working people currently think about this? I think we have to recognise the truth of what the government's agenda is, and Martin touched on this as well. This isn't about balancing the economy. In fact, when David Cameron was asked by a firefighter of whether the money would go back up to public services after the economic crisis is over, his response was, well, let's not think like that. Let's not think that we might have to have public services back again. And I think I know Peter's job is to talk about defence of national pay and conditions, and I think if you look across the piece, what they are doing with the cuts agenda, in my sector of education, they are intent through the Academies programme on breaking up national pay and conditions and privatising it. I'm not an expert in health or higher education, but from what I've read from what Unison say about the government's proposals on health, this breaking up the trust is essentially a form of privatisation of the health service. And it seems to me that what they're doing with letting the fees go free in higher education will allow the space for cheap rate American universities to come in and say, we'll offer you a cheaper deal. So I think that they have this agenda is using the cuts to say there's a crisis and to push a frontier of privatisation that Thatcher never reached, of trying to privatise those very last bits of our welfare state. So I think the stakes are very high, and that brings me on to the question of what we do about it. And am I talking? How much longer have I got?
About 3 minutes.
3 minutes. What I want to say is that we need the demonstration in March, on March the 26th, to be the biggest demonstration that we've been on in our lives. And I think it's possible to do that because we are picking these things up around the country. Sometimes people say, well, the Stop the War demonstration was big, but it didn't change government policy. Well, this one's going to be different because this time it's linked to the possibility of industrial action. We can have a big demonstration and we can have industrial action. It's much more like the demonstrations around the poll tax and the fact that there were all those poll tax groups around the country. We can mobilize on the scale, I think, of the Stop the War demonstration, but then link it into the notion of industrial action. In my union, we see not the most important issue facing education, but the best tactical question for us is around pensions, because it affects every teacher and every other member of the unfunded pension schemes around the country in England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and it affects retired people as well, not just in the public schemes, but in the private schemes. The fact that they are saying this change from RPI to CPI in the uprating of pensions, I think is a complete and utter outrage and disgrace that our members are screaming about. The fact that you've paid into a pension scheme for your entire working life on one basis, one understanding of how they uprate your pension, and then they change it after the fact so that you end up with 15% less in your pension pot is such a disgrace that I think we can use it to mobilise your retired members, because I don't know how many of your schemes won't be affected by RPI CPI, because so many of the private sector schemes will use and the state pension, the state benefits use the same thing. I think we can mobilise on that so that the demonstration in March is huge, but that it's linked to a sense of industrial action against redundancies, against cuts, and against the attacks on our pensions. And I think in that way we can see that we can challenge what this government is doing. There are many Lib Dem MPs already quaking in their boots about what the students are going to do to them at the next election. I think we can make a lot more of their MPs worry about that, and I think there is a real prospect that we can turn them round on many of these questions. If we work together, build those local movements, build for that demonstration, start planning now the coach or whatever you're going to do to get people there, we can make this an event as the start of this programme of other action that can really shake them.